Now, a new report into why Britain went to war in Iraq is vast, 4 times bigger than War and Peace. And it covers everything from reasons to go to war, weapons of mass destruction, and whether politicians misled the public. Well, here on Money Talks, we're going to be looking at the cost of war. Was it all about oil? Were costs covered up? And who made a buck out of the conflict? In a moment, we'll hear from the co-author of the $3 trillion war, Linda Bilmes, and our editor-at-large, who was in Iraq before and after the invasion. But first, this report from Azar Sukri.
It began on March the 19th, 2003. The US-led invasion of Iraq was supposed to be a short, sharp war to topple a dictator. But it raged on for another 8 years, leaving tens of thousands of people dead, millions displaced, and Iraq's biggest industry, oil, in ruins. The head of the inquiry into the UK's role in the war has some scathing words about the aftermath.
Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate.
With much of the country in ruins after the war, foreign investors put billions of dollars into rebuilding there. But falling crude prices and rampant corruption since the end of the war have left about 23% of Iraq's people living below the poverty line. The war was costly for American taxpayers. Initial estimates had ranged from about $10 billion to $100 billion, with war planners saying much of it could be covered by the sale of oil. But the actual cost has been many times that. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz put it at around $3 trillion. There were beneficiaries, though. Many large US companies were hired to provide crucial services and to rebuild Iraq. Among them KBR, a former subsidiary of Halliburton, which in turn was once run by former Vice President Dick Cheney. And even though the war has ended, the violence continues. The government is now fighting terrorists who are able to carry out large-scale suicide bombings, and the UN has urged Iraq to prevent another full-blown sectarian war. Azar Sukri, TRT World.
Well, joining me now is our editor-at-large, Craig Capitas, and Linda Bilmes, who was the co-author of the $3 trillion war. Professor Bilmes, let's just start with that estimate. Your book was published in 2008. Have you changed and revised your estimates for the war?
Oh, we've estimated recently that the war will cost between 4 to 6 trillion. And of course, that doesn't include the interest on the considerable debt that we've run up to finance the war.
And what accounts for that sum going up and the difference between how you estimate and how the US government estimates the costs?
Well, it's an interesting question, Matt, and I think that one of the concerns that we raised in the book and the continuing concerns is the fact that although this is the most expensive war in US history, actually no one in the government is really adding it up. So on a very, very conservative basis, the war will cost us 4 trillion, but there are significant costs that we have already accrued, but that have not yet been paid. For example, fully half of the US troops who have been deployed in Iraq have been granted lifetime disability benefits, but those benefits have not been paid out yet.
Okay.
And there are also extensive economic costs.
Craig, you're listening to Professor Bilmes as well. I imagine what she's saying chimes with your experience in Iraq.
Well, yes, it does. I'm actually referring to my notes from that time. Some people say there was a cover-up. Well, there really wasn't a cover-up, because to cover something up, you actually need to know what to cover up. The United States and Britain were totally clueless going into Iraq vis-a-vis the economics and reconstruction after the war. I could give you many examples. One, I was embedded with a combat engineering commando unit, British Army, Paras. Our objective was to go and secure the very oil fields that the United States government said were going to pay for the war. 48 hours before everyone went through Dallas Crossing, the main entryway into Iraq, the commander came up to me and asked where I had gotten the ordnance survey maps of the wellheads. I had maps of every wellhead in the country. I had gotten them from the Kuwaiti Oil Company. They had never seen these before. The commander immediately got on a radio, and there was a meeting held in a tent with about 12 intelligence and senior command staff. They had never seen these maps before. No one had given them to the units. It wasn't until that time that these soldiers knew precisely where to go. And when the order came for the invasion, they were held back because the command decision from the Americans was get to Baghdad as quickly as possible and forget everything you leave behind.
All right. Now, Craig, looking back, we know that many of the men surrounding the US president at the time said, don't worry, the Iraqi oil will cover the costs. When you were there, what did the Iraqis make of that?
Well, I'm going to go to my notes. A gentleman by the name of Mustafa al-Badar, he was chief engineer and manager of the Iraqi drilling company in charge of 30 oil fields, the very oil fields that were to have paid for the war. I had shown him about D-Day +6, a communique from Central Command spokesman Brigadier General Vincent Brooks. In it, it said, the commerce can begin. Mr. Badar looked at me, and we were under fire at the time, and he said, I can't find food, and America wants to do oil deals. His number two, a gentleman by the name of, extraordinary, a gentleman by the name of Mohammed Barouche. He was the number two. Again, someone who was supposed to go out and get the oil and make sure the facilities were up to snuff and the oil would flow. Again, we're under fire, and Fedayeen, where we are, have stolen an $800,000 oil derrick truck, have wrapped chains around a generator that weighed about 2.5 tons, ripped it off its moorings, and were taking it out of the oil compound. And he said, the Americans have told me that I'm supposed to start pumping 2.6 million barrels of oil a day. Quote, he said again, quote, are the Americans mad?
Would you agree that the war was largely about Iraq's oil rather? And if so, do you think the Americans and their allies have now what they want?
I think one of the things that the Chilcot inquiry makes clear is the scale of the folly in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I testified to the Chilcot inquiry some years ago, and although I think the political scale is clear, what's interesting and probably the one thing that's omitted from the Chilcot report is the scale of the economic folly. At the time that the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the price of oil had been about $23 a barrel for more than 20 years. And within 3 years, the price of oil had risen to $140 a barrel. And this led if you connect the dots, this led the Federal Reserve to inject enormous amount of liquidity into the U.S. economy, which was a contributory factor to the housing bubble, which of course was a main cause of the 2008 financial crisis, which we are still digging our way out of and which of course has reverberated throughout the world. So the scale of the economic folly, which involved oil but was not just about oil, is the untold story of the Iraq invasion, and we don't really know where that is all going to end, in the same way that we don't know the way the political folly is going to end.
What about specifically the oil? Do the Americans and their allies now have the sort of control and access they were looking for?
Well, no, because of course, in addition to the fact that Iraq itself has continued to be, a cesspit and in turmoil. Many non-American companies have been involved in, for example, in doing deals in Kurdistan, for their oil. So the U.S. companies have not really benefited from the oil in the way that they simplistically had imagined they might have prior to the invasion.
Okay, I just want to bring in a few statistics from the conflict now. The U.S. spent at least $138 billion on private security, logistics and reconstruction contractors in Iraq. 10 contractors received just over half of that. Now, the top recipient was KBR, a spin-off of the oilfield service provider Halliburton. It was once run by the U.S. Vice President, the then U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, and had Iraq-related contracts worth nearly $40 billion. Now, the average pay for hired security personnel was $600 a day, but the firms charged the U.S. government an average of $1,100 a day. And that's a very, very steep markup. Professor Bilmes, in your research, did you find private companies making money out of the war and over and above what was reasonable, taking the U.S. taxpayer for a ride?
There was rampant profiteering, and outright fraud, as well as considerable amount of waste and duplication and confusion. However, it's a mistake to think that only the big names like Blackwater and KBR were the main winners, because actually in a paper that I've written looking specifically at who benefited from the war financially, the biggest beneficiaries were some of the smaller companies who you don't hear about, who manufactured things like highly specialized oil products that were used to supply certain types of U.S. aircraft.
Okay, Professor Bilmes and Craig Capitas in Paris, thank you very much, both of you, for your analysis.